This video has the potential to be my single most interesting video to date for all you tech nerds, so you gotta watch the whole thing. I'm coming down like the hammer of Thor in settling this score, which actually ends in friendship. So I made a video, The Hard Truth About Nikon Sensors. The comment section of that video has so much good extra information and speculation that it begs for more research, which I did, so you don't have to. In this video, we are digging deeper into the truth behind Nikon sensors. I have to first establish the following. The rumor about Nikon buying off-the-shelf Sony sensors has no evidence that I could find. I only found that that applies to a few Coolpix cameras which have very little modifications done from a base Sony sensor design. I'm going to link an interesting read in the description that my friend 𝑭𝑻𝑪 dropped for me in the channel member Discord, but I want to read an excerpt from this particular article where the writer was granted a rare, great honor and opportunity to tour the Nikon sensor design process and talk with the team leader, whose name I know I'm going to screw up later, so I apologize, but the team leader of the Nikon D850 sensor development team. And I quote, "Prior to my tour, I had no idea Nikon's engineering extended as deep as it does. Some of that is just a result of the many years since I was actively involved in the semiconductor industry, but the level of design, simulation, and testing I saw was frankly astonishing. Why design an original sensor? It's a fair question. Commodity sensors, ones you can just buy from a sensor manufacturer's catalog, are really quite good these days. So why would Nikon make the huge investment to design their own from the ground up? I asked about this, and it turns out there are a number of reasons, many having to do with being able to optimize the camera system as a whole in ways that you can't if you're just using off-the-shelf parts. In answering my question, Sanbungi-san talked in part about the need to match sensor designs to the capabilities of Nikon's X-Speed image processing engines, which are also designed in-house, and about being able to tailor performance to the level of camera each sensor will be used in. Another surprise to me, though, was the extent to which he talked about matching sensor designs to the characteristics of Nikkor lenses. So it turns out the primary practice is Nikon doesn't just buy some stuff that Sony has laying around. It begins with the system as a whole in mind. They design their sensors to work with their in-house designed image processors and to get the most out of their in-house designed and manufactured lenses. My dive dove me into verifying how Sony runs its companies, as it's been mentioned that they run independently. This turned out to be true-ish. The best way to describe how Sony's many companies work is an umbrella. And this isn't even that weird. I actually see this exact arrangement in the manufacturing industry that I work in. The umbrella that I am familiar with is IMC, International Metalworking Company. In a nutshell, it's Warren Buffett. In this group, there are Ingersoll, Iscar, Tungaloy, Supermill, etc. They all make the same kind of stuff. Metalworking tools. There are also whole manufacturing facilities, let's call one Z9 Machine Company, that are also under the IMC group, in which it's common for those manufacturing facilities to only use brands under the IMC umbrella. A little monopolistic feeling, but not quite there legally. In most cases, these other companies under the umbrella are rather independent, and there are no rules on how aggressively they can even compete with each other. So, if Warren Buffett equals Sony, then Z9 Machine Company and Iscar equals Sony Semiconductor Solutions and Sony Electronics Corporation. The actual term for how Sony runs its many divisions, including its music and video entertainment, consumer electronics, and semiconductor manufacturing divisions, is a decentralized business model. Some of these divisions may be linked, but they operate with varying levels of autonomy. This isn't even that weird. This kind of business model is known to have good results for a brand as wide-reaching as Sony when it comes to innovation in the decentralized business's various specializations, which leads us casually into the next point. In the first video, I mentioned the fear that some people have about Sony gatekeeping technology and how that made less sense to me than a fear about Sony stealing designs because Nikon and Sony both design their own sensors. But I looked and looked and looked for any lawsuits that may have occurred in the past over sensor theft, and I could not find anything. I was actually surprised that there weren't any. So surprised, in fact, that I turned to AI to help me find anything, and it couldn't either. There are actually no public records of Sony stealing any designs from any camera company. Granted, such disputes are usually not made public unless significant legal action is taken, so at the very least, I have no proof of patent infringement or breach of NDA, but I think it's more wholesome than that. While the camera industry is very competitive and there are most definitely sometimes disputes in this and semiconductor industries, the relationships turn out to be highly collaborative. Nikon pushes forward sensor designs and Sony improves on the development of sensor technology and has the ability to produce Nikon designs on a very large scale. So big that it's producing for themselves, Nikon, some Canon video equipment like Apple, Fujifilm, Olympus, and so on. A little side piece. I mentioned in the original video that Sony doesn't need to steal people's sensor designs. That turned out to be correct, and now I find it a little insulting to Sony to assume so because, as it turns out, Sony stands on its own merits in this field. Sony isn't just a sweatshop manufacturer, but it is actually a leader and innovator in image sensor research and development. Just like everyone else who is designing their own stuff and having Sony do it under NDA. So there is no financial incentive to rob someone else, and they actually don't need to rob someone else because they can do it themselves. So Nikon, as you may know, goes beyond cameras and lenses. They also make these things. That's a lithography machine, which are used where? In the semiconductor manufacturing industry. I said in the last video that Nikon has made their own sensors before, so they know how. Well, they actually know how to make the machines that make them. You may think that this is even more outrageous that Nikon doesn't just make the sensors, so I dug into why. I couldn't find anything, so I searched for any statement from Nikon on why they don't. I still couldn't find anything where Nikon explicitly states why they don't make their own sensors. However, as it relates to lithography equipment, their machines are generally used for older or larger node production, and the industry has moved towards smaller sizes. Just a fun fact, ASML apparently is considered the industry standard now as they specialize in the smaller area. Sony, so far as I can find, relies primarily on ASML for their semiconductor crafting machines. That was a mouthful. While there is no exact indication that Nikon plays a major role in Sony manufacturing facilities today, there may be some indications, but nothing publicly, that says that Sony has used Nikon lithography before, and maybe it still does outside of camera sensor manufacturing. That just shows you that the industry is even more collaborative than you may have thought, and it goes way back. It's hard to know for sure because Sony doesn't just let anyone inside their sensor making facilities. Today, Nikon focuses its lithography on what it already does well, and it's working for them so far. So now going back to why Nikon doesn't just make a lithography machine to make their own modern camera sensors, because they haven't outright said why, I think it's pretty fair to make a few guesses. 1. As I said in the last video, manufacturing these sensors is incredibly expensive, and so are the facilities required to do so. While Nikon definitely has and could again, they aren't a leader in this area, clearly. Sony, however, is. They have an established expertise specifically in the field of image sensor development and manufacturing, which is why the number 2 point inherently is, Sony is established and ready to produce Nikon's designs at a large scale already. No new buildings needed. Economies of scale. They can make so many sensors so quick that it is now cheaper. That means faster and cheaper for you, the consumer. We established that Sony is a leader in the image sensors, and since Nikon can rely on Sony to keep up with demand, this allows Nikon to focus on its greater strengths: cameras, lenses, and image processing. The fact remains that Nikon still designs the architecture and specifications of the sensors found in their cameras, but their strong partnership with Sony allows them to focus their minds and money on other important aspects of what they do. Money brings us deeper into the next point. This is an industry partnership. Nikon is still designing their sensors, so while Sony dumps a lot of money into advancing the overall image sensor technology in the world as a whole, Nikon is allowed to allocate less money into a smaller team to specifically work on designing what they need out of a sensor, and Sony builds said design. Sony improves the wheel. Nikon says, "My wheel needs to do this." The demand of photographers and photographers alike is rapidly changing. I don't even know if it's feasible or at the very least smart for Nikon to start building its own sensors anymore. Today, we need 4K 120. Tomorrow, we demand 8K 240 with avocado tracking that doesn't overheat for $500. Sony's massive size gives them the strength to rapidly shift and develop the base sensors to handle our rapidly advancing desires. Nikon gets to keep their money and lenses great enough to have the prettiest avocado you ever did track. Why does said avocado look so good? Well, we are going to cover that right now. I did just a little dig. It wasn't hard. And I got a rough step-by-step process of how Nikon image sensors come into existence. I could almost see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was emerging from the rabbit hole. Raw materials are needed, so high-quality silicon dioxide was already being mined and exported from countries like Australia, the United States, Brazil, China, and India to companies in Japan like Shin-Etsu Chemical in Simcoe and Global Wafers in Taiwan to be turned into the silicon wafers needed to make image sensors, all before Nikon employees wake up for their Monday morning shift. Nikon's engineering team designs the architecture and foundation of what their image sensor needs to be. This includes, but is not limited to, the resolution, pixel structure, sensor type, probably CMOS because at the making of this video that's the standard, and desired dynamic range and color accuracy. Next, the design goes to Sony, who already has a stock of silicon wafers provided by the companies above, and they can get to work on image sensor fabrication. This fabrication process includes photolithography, etching, doping, and deposition, a process longer than I want to describe here today. Sorry. Other components, however, go into the sensor assembly as well, like micro lenses and color filter arrays, which are produced by Sony, but also other companies you've heard of like Hoya and Sharp. Meanwhile, Nikon has already designed its own image processor, X-Speed, and is responsible for how it works with its sensor design. How the two communicate has nothing to do with Sony. The designs must work together. They also partnered with Renesas to build the physical chip that is the X-Speed processor. Nikon then takes these two components in-house and ensures they work together as designed. They must calibrate the sensor for color balance, white balance, noise reduction calibration, pixel mapping to remove dead pixels, sharpness, and detail. That's the tweaking, as we like to call it. These components then head to Nikon facilities where they are assembled with other wholly Nikon imagined designs into the cameras we all love. They are then quality inspected, packaged, and shipped. So, if Nikon designed the sensor, and Nikon designed the image processor, and tweaked and calibrated the output, then without Nikon, you literally just have a fucking wafer. A thin, light-sensitive slice of oxygen and silica, literally air and earth crust components, compressed into this thing that you shouldn't touch or blow on. You have raw data with nowhere to go. Nikon images look the way they do because Nikon designed them to look that way, with decades of research, development, and customer preference guiding them. So, my question to everyone out there is, if it takes the whole planet getting along with each other and working together to make the finished products that we like, then why can't we two all just get along and work together? I'm Z-Wade, the Z-Wade, and Z-Wade Photo. Stay sharp, YouTube.